public who are here in the gallery or watching online. In August 2025, the New South Wales Minister for Local Government announced updates to the Code of Meeting Practice, which took effect from the 31st of December 2025. As part of these changes, briefing sessions previously held exclusively for councillors are now prohibited. In the absence of these briefings and to assist councillors in their decision-making role, councillors are able to be provided information and are able to ask questions about a matter to be considered at a council meeting, provided that that information is also available to the public. This forum has been arranged for that purpose. Tonight, councillors will be provided with information and the opportunity to ask questions in relation to the New South Wales Government's A New Approach to Strategic Planning discussion paper, Sydney Plan and the statewide Industrial Lands Policy. Through observation of the forum, in person or online, the public has access to the same information. While questions are permitted, it is important that councillors understand that under the Code of Meeting Practice, councillors are prohibited from discussing the information provided at this forum, and therefore questions must be direct and succinct. This forum is being recorded and made publicly available on Council's website. By attending the forum, you're giving consent to your image and voice being webcast. Councillors, council staff and members of the public must ensure that mobile phones are turned to silent during the forum, and councillors who need to use their phone to text, talk or engage in social media activity must leave the chamber to do so. The forum will be chaired by myself in my capacity as CEO, with presentations undertaken by council staff. Council staff will remain seated while undertaking their presentations. Questions will be invited at the end of the presentation or at the end of sections of the presentation. Councillors have been provided with notepads and pens, and as officers work through the presentation, you're encouraged to write down the presentation slide number and question that you wish to ask. Questions may be asked by pressing the button on your microphone to alert the chair you have a question, and once called, you may stand to ask your question. Once again, questions must be direct and succinct without discussion. Council officers will stand to answer your question or take the question on notice if they are unable to answer it tonight. Tonight's presentation will be undertaken by Council's Director of Planning and Environment, Mr. Marcelo Ocuzzi, and supported by Stephanie Lum, Strategic Planning Team Leader of Policy. Given references to infrastructure within the plans, Council's Director of Open Space and Infrastructure also joins us. Before we start, may I ask that Mayor Zoe Baker give an acknowledgement of country.
On behalf of all those present and those watching on the webcast, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders and spirits past, present and emerging.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Tonight we have received apologies from Councillor Carr, Councillor Keane, and Councillor Hoyt is joining us online. I will now pass over to the Director of Planning and Environment.
Thank you. Good evening, councillors and those of you joining us online. Tonight we'll be presenting three state government strategic planning documents that have been placed on public exhibition in December of last year. To assist our councillors consider a report that's a fairly lengthy report. It's a fairly dense report at its council meeting on the 23rd of February. Next. So the three strategic planning documents that we'll be taking you through tonight are A New Approach to Strategic Planning. That's a discussion paper prepared by the state government. The Sydney Plan, which is the regional plan which seeks to set the directions for the growth of Sydney, and the statewide policy for industrial lands. These plans were placed on public exhibition on the 10th of December, and they ceased their public exhibition process on the 27th of February. So, as I say, there is now a document on the public record that you will consider at your meeting on the 23rd. Next. So the first of these, I should hasten to add, we'll be spending more time on the Sydney Plan, which is the most detailed of these plans and most relevance, in our opinion, to North Sydney Council. The other two plans, the discussion paper on strategic planning and the industrial lands strategic plan, we'll discuss in less detail. So the first of these is the new approach to strategic planning. The purpose, as is stated there in the slide, is to set out how the New South Wales government wants to guide and manage population and economic growth across the state over the next 20 years. Its objectives are to reduce duplication across the planning system, align housing, jobs and infrastructure planning, support councils with clearer guidance and direction, and make planning priorities and policies easier to navigate. They're the objectives and that's the purpose. Thank you. Next. So this slide tries to illustrate, taken directly from this discussion paper, how the approach of planning at the state level seeks to be cascaded down to the local level. The diagram there shows where we sit in terms of the regional plan, and that's the regional plan for Metropolitan Sydney, the Sydney plan. We'll talk about that in a minute. Perhaps the most obvious point of difference in this plan compared to previous plans is the missing district plan. So what is happening here is the second level of planning is identified there on the right-hand side, being the Sydney plan, the Metropolitan Plan for Sydney, the Lower Hunter and Central Coast Plan, the Illawarra and Shoalhaven Plan, and then the rest of New South Wales, fairly amorphous mass that is. But what is lacking, in our opinion, is the district plan, which previously supported the growth and guidance in a strategic planning sense for the Northern District of Sydney. How this has been replaced is a plan to guide local planning at the metropolitan level. So you've got a metropolitan plan, a regional plan that actually includes 33 local government areas. It's an enormous area that's been guided in the strategic planning sense, and one that obviously has a huge amount of diversity. Next. So there are 7 priorities in the state plan. They relate to Aboriginal outcomes, to housing, to prosperity or the economy, to connectedness or transport, resilience, livability, and the coordination, particularly of infrastructure. So those aspects and components of the state plan then are cascaded down into the regional plan for Sydney, the Sydney plan in this case, and the idea then is that local governments within Sydney will need to take guidance from that plan to influence how their local plans are drafted. Next. Are there any questions before I move on to the statewide policy for industrial lands? Thanks. Next.
Madam Mayor.
Right. That loss of the district plan, it doesn't appear from the report that's going to council or from my reading of the Sydney plan that there's any clarity around economic, around jobs numbers for a place like North Sydney. In the absence of that, where does it leave us?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. There is some slides on that coming up. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Thanks. Next. So the statewide policy for industrial lands, I actually think this is a very important document. It has limited application to North Sydney, but it is one of those components of our land use matrix, I suppose, that comes under significant pressure from the current drive to provide more housing across the state. And in some local government areas, some of those industrial lands are quite vulnerable to loss, and they do generally need to be protected to ensure our economic future. Notwithstanding that, the purpose of this draft policy is to provide guidance on planning for industrial land across the entire state. Its objectives are to secure, intensify, and actively manage industrial lands, to respond to the changing needs of industry, including emerging industries, to support other government initiatives relating to industry attraction and investment, to allow for appropriate alternate uses where they're strategically justified and consistent with predetermined criteria. There's a couple more objectives that are not very relevant to North Sydney, so I'll go on. Next. So you can see here, this is the sum total, almost the sum total of all of North Sydney's industrially zoned land. We've got in the darker purple colour there, we've got the working waterfront zone, the W4 zone, that is diminishing almost as we speak. You see there on the western side of Berries Bay, on the left-hand side of the page, the corridor that is actually being developed as we speak by Transport for New South Wales to extend Parradale Park and that open space corridor. Council staff are in the process of preparing a planning proposal to effectively amend that zone and to allow a more reflective zone of what will be there in the future, and a more hopefully a more flexible zone as well. The other bits of W4 zone there are the Noakes development on the eastern side of Berries Bay, and then flanking Milson Park as well. They're locally significant, identified as locally significant industrial zones. And then the central part there in McMahon's Point is a zone which is a slightly unusual one. I always have to remind myself the name of that zone. It's an E3 productivity support zone, which it's got a whole collection of basically office type uses and semi-industrial uses. It is perhaps an unusual collection of uses in a Sydney context. Next. I won't go through this table in its entirety, but these are I suppose, a summary of the directions that the plan seeks to establish, starting with the state significant industrially zoned land. We don't have any in North Sydney, so we'll move on. The regionally significant, which is that productivity support zone in McMahon's Point. There's 2.6 hectares of that. That's sought to be protected. Residential uses are not supported in that zone, and the level of protection afforded to that really does require, in draft form at least, that the Department of Planning is heavily involved in its future. In terms of the locally significant sites, I've described them already, slightly more flexible in terms of their future uses. And the council may consider, under its own volition, how to utilise those, as long as alternative employment lands are considered and supported. Next. So in terms of the recommendations, excuse me, in response to this policy, there is one very small sliver of W4 zone land just off Shirley Road there before you get to Berries Island as you're travelling south, which apparently is owned by Fisheries. Wasn't aware of that. So that needs to be identified. The next point there is about recategorising the 3 productivity support zone to reflect a more locally significant industrial base, to clarify the role of councils in planning and managing regionally significant industrial land and provide greater autonomy in managing and planning regionally significant land. Those 2 dot points are related. Excuse me. Clarify how the matters for consideration are intended to be implemented when determining rezoning applications. And the plan does include a little bit of a matrix there about the sorts of things to be considered. I suppose what our report is calling for is more guidance and certainty to ensure that, as the last dot point there talks about, we don't consider ad hoc and individual rezoning applications for individual sites. This council has a long-standing practice of ensuring that the precincts are considered on a precinct basis rather than on an individual site basis, and on the basis of being highly consultative, and on the basis also of ensuring public benefit is achieved through those processes. Next.
You can have a question on that section.
Yes, please.
For slide 8 and 9, that regionally significant industrial land in McMahon's Point, are data centres a possible use for regionally significant industrial land? And would they be for locally significant?
Yeah, look, I'll have to take that on notice. I'm not sure. I can look it up, but that will take 5 minutes. So I'll look it up and I'll get back to councillors on that one. Data centres. So we move on to the draft Sydney plan, the regional plan to guide Sydney's future. Next. So Sydney actually has a long history of regional planning, starting off in 1948 with the County of Cumberland Plan. I think this is the 9th plan to be developed for Sydney. The purpose of the plan, as you would expect, is to guide and manage growth over the next 20 years, it states. That's the stated purpose. I think some of the attributes of the plan are contradictory to that. The plan states that it aims to guide state and local strategic planning and assessments, infrastructure planning and prioritisation, and public and private investment decisions. If this is adopted, so it's in draft form, the state government is taking submissions. If adopted, it will replace the metropolits of 3 cities as well as the North District Plan. Next. So these next couple of slides, I won't read them, but they seek to illustrate how the state plan priorities, all 7 of them, are implemented and cascade down to the Sydney plan. I won't go through them. If you go through the next slide, they're reasonably established objectives and directions that I won't go through, but not too much new in any of those. Next. And this is sort of cutting that notion slightly different way. So the 7 policy directions or strategic directions of the state plan and how they're embedded in each of the 12 responses of the regional plan. So the regional plan is essentially split into 2 parts. The first part being a description of Sydney and its different attributes, jobs, housing, open space, the environment, and so on. And then the second part is how the plan seeks to respond to the various challenges that are arising given those things. So those little coloured figures try to illustrate how the different state plan policy directions are embedded in each one of those. Can't actually read it from here, but I think just as an example, response 1, implementing Sydney housing targets, are seeking to achieve obviously the housing direction of the state plan, the connected direction, the livability one, and I think that says coordination as well. Next. So we move on to the 12 responses of the Sydney plan, and I'll go through these one by one. Some are less relevant, so I'll skip through fairly quickly. First one is very relevant for all councils in Sydney. So this is about implementing Sydney's housing targets. The disappointing thing about this one, so it sets out some targets there for North Sydney, 5,900 new dwellings between 2024 and 2029. This arose out of the Housing Accord back in 2024. We've known about these targets for almost 2 years. Given that this is a 20-year plan, it is disappointing that there aren't at least 10-year targets, if not 20-year targets, because if the basis of growth is or one of the inputs of growth is new housing, then the various components that support housing need to be planned as well. So to be provided with only a 5-year target, actually a 3-year target, is most disappointing. The various activities and responses there for committing the New South Wales Government. I'll just go through them quickly. Is to develop and implement a revised housing supply and diversity monitoring framework, to continue to investigate and implement new statutory provisions, to fast-track assessment of council-led housing proposals, to lead planning interventions to increase housing supply if councils fail to meet housing targets. At the local level, so what we would be required to do is to review and update local strategic planning and local environmental plans to align with the Sydney plan and to provide sufficient feasible capacity to meet housing targets. Next. So as I say, would be good, ideal to have a 20-year target for these housing targets, but 10 years would be better than 5, because developing the local housing strategy, our local strategic planning statement, takes time, and planning for the next 3 years is a little nonsensical. We need a further time horizon to work with. We need clearer recognition in setting and assessing housing targets that council can only provide for. Sorry, I'll start again. The point of that one is that council can only provide for growth by approving proposals and assessing applications, but we're not responsible for actually delivering housing. And there's been lots of discussion in the media about certain councils not stepping up and not approving enough housing for growth and to accommodate growth. The facts of the matter are that North Sydney Council has approved something like 2,000 new dwellings since July of 2024. Not all of those have borne fruit and are actually developed on the ground. There are different reasons for that. There are complex reasons for those things, but council certainly has done that. In addition to that, we have something like over 4,000 dwellings in the pipeline through state significant development applications, something like 250 dwellings also in the pipeline with low to mid-rise housing proposals on our books right now. So the third dot point there is to identify where long-term future infrastructure is planned. Again, going back to the 5-year/3-year target, that's exceedingly difficult. Recognise the need to consider local character, heritage and amenity when planning for growth. Obviously, we are very focused at the moment at the state level and regional and local level as well in numbers and providing for that growth. But we shouldn't lose sight of all of those important things in our urban environment that support growth and make people's lives more interesting and livable. Also implementing a policy that would prevent the net loss of often more affordable housing units on individual development sites. We're seeing some of that, particularly through the low to mid-rise housing reforms, where sometimes 6, 7, 10 units are being replaced by a lower number of units of more expensive character. Next.
Good question.
End of this section.
Sorry?
Can we just hold questions?
Yeah,
to
sure.
the end of the
Absolutely.
Response number 2 is about increasing housing diversity and choice. The diagram that's included in the strategic plan is a fairly standard one that's been around for a little while, which tries to describe the different types of housing that is occurring through Sydney, from at one end of the spectrum, single occupancy homes, to at the other end of the spectrum, high-rise apartment buildings. And on the right-hand side of that drawing, you see there the preferred dwelling mix that the plan seeks to achieve in a broad sense. Next. Just have the next one in. Thanks. So the plan talks about the following commitments for the state government in terms of this housing diversity and choice, is to investigate planning and control incentives relating to housing diversity and requirements for family-friendly apartments in mid and high-rise residential development, to update guidance to consent authorities, industry and the community to make sure the apartment design guide is being used flexibly to achieve positive objectives evaluated through merit assessment, to investigate further opportunities for low-rise attached housing. And the council commitments through the plan are to review LEPs, contributions plans, DCPs, as they relate to low to mid-rise housing areas designated under the policy, to identify areas outside of those low to mid-rise housing areas that can accommodate more diverse housing choice based on public transport connections, to review minimum lot size requirements for dual occupancies outside of those low to mid-rise housing areas, and to consider more ways to provide high density development around stations and other transit hubs. Next. So the recommendations in response to that one, many of those are fairly sensible. Our major concern is to ensure that the Apartment Design Guide as a central assessment tool, which was introduced more than 10 years ago, is retained. It has been a very useful tool to guide and assess development proposals for housing developments, to ensure levels of amenity, standards of design, and environmental performance are achieved. It was introduced more than 10 years ago to take some of the rough edges out of those types of developments, and I think it's been quite successful in doing that. I think we need to take care, and the government needs to take care not to kind of head down the path of cutting too many corners of quality to achieve growth. The second point there is about providing new and upgraded infrastructure and provide councils with greater flexibility with regard to the collection and expenditure of local infrastructure contributions to address the limitations of the local infrastructure contribution system. This is a well-worn path in local government. There are huge amounts of constraint on the expenditure of sometimes large amounts of money that are heavily restricted in an environment where we're trying to provide as much housing as possible. Supporting that housing with local infrastructure is critically important. This is a theme that runs through a couple of these responses. I think we need to ensure that we are as flexible as possible in using these funds, and government needs to acknowledge the limitations of local government and its financial capacity to do this. Next. Response number 3 is to secure the supply of affordable housing. The plan commits the New South Wales Government to deliver an affordable housing contributions scheme toolkit to support councils to fast track the preparation and adoption of an affordable housing contribution scheme, to maximise the affordable housing outcomes delivered under the TOD and infill housing programs by creating more flexible arrangements for contributions. And council's commitments are to prepare and adopt an affordable housing contribution scheme, and also to identify surplus council-owned land for affordable housing. I note that council is working on both of those items at the moment. Next. What we're recommending in the report is to expand the framework to explicitly ask that state government not focus so much on the private sector providing for what we say is short-term affordable housing, but to actually commit to delivering to ensure a more sustainable supply of affordable housing across Sydney and across New South Wales, supported by sustained funding and delivery models. Secondly, lead the policy development, funding and delivery of affordable housing, including incentivising the delivery of affordable housing in perpetuity by amending planning controls and through the assessment of state significant development applications. As we know, the first tranche of bonus provisions in planning documents was introduced more than 15 years ago. A lot of those affordable housing units that were delivered then are no longer affordable housing units. They are now market housing, and that wave will continue through. So you'll have a steady supply of new affordable housing whilst you've got a steady loss of affordable housing units if we continue down the temporary 10 to 15 year basis of policy settings that we have at the moment. We're also requesting that we establish clear partnership mechanisms between councils and state agencies to unlock suitable sites and accelerate delivery. At the moment, navigating that process is very difficult in local government land. So clarifying that and making it as easy as possible would be good. And ensuring affordable housing outcomes are embedded within a broader placemaking and livability framework, not just treated in isolation, which hopefully goes without saying, but it is worth saying. Next. Response number 4, grow well-located jobs. So we're moving into the jobs environment there. This is a drawing that is included in the plan, the CBD, the drawing there on the left-hand side, identifies the North Sydney CBD, for example. Interestingly, we've got for the first time, a ratio of employment to residential land uses, an 80-20 split in this case. The commercial centre, which we have one, which is the St Leonard's Centre, a 70-30 split, employment to residential split, and then lower order, retail centres and residential centres. Next. This is a little bit busy. The main point, I suppose, out of this one is there are some broad targets there, some employment jobs targets for different centres. The point that I wanted to make in this slide is that North Sydney, for the first time, whilst in the previous or current plan, the regional plan for Sydney, we're identified as having a symbiotic relationship, I suppose, with the Sydney CBD. This plan actually groups North Sydney and Sydney City together in terms of its targets, which really blurs the lines around where North Sydney's role is. So I just wanted to make that point before I move on to the next slide. The other point there that I'll make at the next slide. Next. So the plan actually includes the following commitments for the state government: to finalise the centre's policy, including guidance on mixed use or residential zone land in and around commercial core, review and update employment zone planning policy for centres, and then council will be required to review and update planning controls for the E1 and E2 zones, the E2 zone being our city core zone for the North Sydney CBD, within the identified low and mid-rise housing areas, to increase floor space for goods and services to meet the needs of new residents and to consider shop top housing. So that's introducing a level of residential development in our commercial zones. And the last point there: investigate and implement revised statutory provisions to enable new jobs in and out of centres, including responding to infrastructure availability. Next. So the recommendations here really is around providing certainty for the North Sydney CBD. This plan, in our opinion, doesn't do that. The previous current regional plan provides lots of specific direction and guidance, not only for the council, but also for the investment sector, for the private sector to be guided with certainty and security around where they're heading in terms of investment decisions. So the first dot point there is about providing greater certainty for our commercial centre in the North Sydney CBD. The second one there is to provide clearer guidance and mitigating measures in the plan to address the impacts of diminishing employment functions in commercial centres. And I would note the build to rent, for example, permissibility that was introduced 4 or 5 years ago in our CBD, as well as the Housing Delivery Authority decisions that are allowing individual residential development to occur within our centres. Third dot point there: provide separate and clearly defined employment projections, capacity targets and vision for the North Sydney CBD to ensure that planning measures support its economic growth and longer term certainty is established. To clarify how state-led pathways, including the Housing Delivery Authority processes, will protect employment land and maintain an appropriate balance between jobs and housing targets, and services, and to provide mechanisms to address centres unable to meet the target land use ratio of commercial residential, such as the St Leonard's Commercial Centre. You saw there that the previous slide had an ideal of a 70% employment factor in the St Leonard's Centre. The TOD controls fundamentally undermine that and defy that. I think we would be lucky to be reaching 40 or 50% employment in that centre as the TOD development pans out. Next. Response number 5, there's 12 of these. Response number 5 is to align infrastructure to planned growth. So this is all about infrastructure. The New South Wales government, through this plan, commits to develop and annually update the Sydney Infrastructure Opportunities Plan, to publish best practice guidance for councils when planning for and providing local infrastructure. Council actions is to use the Urban Development Program and the Employment Lands Development Program data to inform infrastructure planning at the local level, to regularly review infrastructure contribution plans to reflect the infrastructure priorities and staging through the UDP and ELDP, to review infrastructure schedules to reflect land use planning directions and current works and acquisition costs, and to identify specific planned infrastructure works to be delivered within council delivery programs and operational plans. Next. So our recommendations are as I said before, the plan is a 20-year plan, but it really doesn't, as was the case in previous plans, it doesn't really elaborate on where those large-scale infrastructure projects will be. Things like transport, schools, hospitals, in accordance with the spatial strategies and position statements of the government strategic plans. We are recommending to collaborate with the state government agencies to provide a vision and certainty regarding future infrastructure provision, and to address the limitations, as I've said, about our local contributions framework. Next. Response number 6 is to create a more vibrant Sydney. So this is all about building on post-COVID, making our centres more vibrant. The state government commits to activate key arts and entertainment precincts and promote cultural institutions, state-owned performance venues and cultural festivals through flexible zoning controls, active street frontage requirements and expedited planning pathways. Consult with council and communities to establish special entertainment precincts where appropriate in state-led rezonings and state significant development. And the council is to establish special entertainment precincts where appropriate to accommodate critical community, arts, cultural and retail uses as part of council-led precinct planning. Next. So this is reasonably straightforward, and I think we're in alignment. We acknowledge the important role of local government in design-led place-based planning and good urban design in creating vibrant places. So we play a very, very important role. Acknowledge and provide guidance on how to grow and manage the visitor economy, including investigating opportunities to expand business tourism in North Sydney.
Councillors, given that we are halfway through the 12 responses, we might stop here and ask if there are any questions on the responses to date. Councillor Holding.
Thank you. I just had a question all the way back on page 16. It's Council Actions 1.4 to review and update local strategic planning and local environment plans to align with the Sydney plan. My question is, obviously that would appear to be the removal or the review or alignment of the LEP and the DCP with the Sydney plan. I'll be throwing away, is there potential to throw away some of the usefulness of that that heritage of planning and whether you have concerns around that?
Thanks for the question. I'm not particularly concerned about that. I think the concern will be with new heritage controls and new heritage zoned areas. I think that the existing layer of heritage controls, personally, I'm reasonably comfortable that will be retained. So I don't see a risk there. However, you know, the next tranche of changes of the state government may challenge that.
Mayor Baker.
Well, it's sort of on the same side. It's more generally, as I said before, with the lack of real jobs targets that apply to North Sydney, and with such short-term housing targets, it makes it almost impossible to update an LEP to align with this Sydney plan, because it's not specific enough for North Sydney. And in fact, so your comments around that employment land, because effectively your recommendations is all of the lobbying we've been doing with the state government. And really it's about how do we see that through an amendment to this draft?
Thank you, Mayor Baker. Absolutely. So the report on the agenda spends a little bit of time talking about that, and we were well served, and we have been well served by the existing plan. We've had meetings in the past with significant landowners, big investors in the CBD, and they've been buoyed by the clear direction that's been provided for the North Sydney CBD, as opposed to the St Leonards Centre. We need to maintain that kind of a blurry strategic environment will not serve us well.
Councillor Santa.
Thank you. Page 21, point 3.1. Is that develop an affordable housing contribution scheme toolkit. Could you outline what that toolkit will entail?
Thank you, Councillor. That's actually a responsibility of the state government. So what they are seeking to do is a lot of councils are trying to get on to preparing these contributions plans. They are hitting some roadblocks, having to knock on lots of doors. The idea of this, I think, is the state government is seeking to expedite those, make it as easy as possible, provide that toolkit to advance these contribution schemes and make it easier. So the council is in the process of preparing one, and one of the key components of that is a feasibility tool to ensure that whatever contribution rate that we apply in North Sydney will be able to be affordable for developers as they come in and develop land.
Councillor Berrigan.
Thank you. Page 16, again, following up what you said, which is councils don't actually build the houses. The title gross completions by LGA, is that our title or is that the state government title?
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, that's the state government's. That's a snip taken straight out of the plan. And yeah, look, unfortunately, the target is set as a completion. So council obviously doesn't have a huge amount of control over that, except the volume of approvals. I'm confident that the volume of approvals is satisfactory and will contribute significantly to the 5,900. If not meet it, then overwhelm it. As I say, over 4,000 dwellings in the pipeline at the moment as applications, closer to 5,000. But seeing those through to completion is another matter, which, as I said at the outset, it's a very complex cycle and mix of issues that are involved in that.
Thank you. And just to follow up, if I can, I agree. I think putting that kind of language actually by default, everybody reads that council is responsible for the housing. I just wanted to also ask, has any discussion come through about having a measure of no net loss of housing?
Councillor, not yet. There is an outstanding council resolution for us to follow up on, which we will get to, and we have made advances to the New South Wales government. At the moment, there isn't a huge amount of enthusiasm for that. I have to say, we are recommending that be included. If we're serious about providing additional housing, then that really should be one of the fundamentals, I would have thought.
And just one further question. Thank you. Is there any talk about resourcing for all of this additional assessment of applications for housing, i.e. the people who are actually doing as in the council work, if we are expected to be approving all these new housing, is there any talk from the state government about resourcing for councils to do this additional work on top of what's already done?
Thank you, Councillor. No, we are recommending that occur through this report. The opposite is actually happening through the state significant development applications. What is actually happening is our local communities are reaching out to council staff for assistance when they're being informed of these state significant development proposals, and we're helping as much as we can, but that's of course diverting already limited resources. In addition to that, we're having to, within extraordinarily compressed timeframes, respond to extraordinarily complex proposals that are state significant developments. So it's a bit of a double whammy.
Just one final question. There does seem to be a lot of comment about what to do around transport hubs. One is to provide high density, and then, oh, sorry, thanks. One is to provide in the high density development for residential, and then there's also one to provide in exactly the same space jobs. Is this conflict being addressed anywhere?
Thanks for the question, Councillor. Look, I don't think so. I think the idea is that we have a vibrant mix of things. We are yet to see really successful examples of those mixed-use developments. So we're trying, particularly in places like St Leonards, but I suppose it's work in progress.
Mayor Baker?
Just whether you have any information beyond the Sydney plan about when the department is thinking about, they've just said here 25 to 26 on page 25 for the finalisation of the centres policy, because that again leaves us with a dearth of information around that mix between a CBD and, well, the residential that can undermine it. My recollection was they were meant to provide it last year.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Baker. No, we don't have any more information on that, but obviously there's things that we need information on and guidance on before we undertake to commit resources to these strategic planning bits of work.
Thank you, councillors. I'll ask Mr. Accusey to continue.
Thank you. So I think we'd done that one. We'll move on next. So this next response is all about public open space provision. The state government commits to reviewing and refining the identified network of high priority blue-green grid corridors. Excuse me, to deliver projects and programs to create or expand metropolitan public open space, to provide open space provision guidance and targets. The council's responsibilities under this plan are to review our existing and future open space provision and identify local opportunities to align with New South Wales Government's open space outcomes. Next. So our recommendations are, first of all, to acknowledge the extreme challenges that we face, especially in places like North Sydney, of high land prices, high land fragmentation as well, of undeveloped land. So that's the first part, to also acknowledge that open space targets should consider both the quantity of open space and also the quality of open space. And I would make the point, this drawing that's provided in the plan identifies how many hectares of open space is provided per 1,000 persons. Now that's a desktop exercise, and as an example there you see the Cammeray Golf Course is identified as an area of open space. I understand that it's currently fenced and difficult to access, so accessibility is important, usability is important. Another example is the Hume Street Park, which again in this desktop exercise would lead one to think that there is some open space there. As we know, Hume Street Park has a basketball facility, some car parking and a childcare centre, and it's a fairly steep slope on the areas that you can access. So these sorts of nuances also need to be recognised. The third dot point there is a request to explain how open space targets will be funded, how land will be secured in established areas, and how targets will be applied in high density and TOD contexts. Provide maps in collaboration with councils which indicate projected population growth and density to guide future equitable distribution of open space. And the last dot point there is opportunities for increasing public access to existing large land holdings like the Cammeray Golf Course. Next. So the response aid is about industrial lands. We've discussed that, so we'll go to the next slide. Number 9 is about minimising the impact of natural hazards, protecting people, communities and built environments from natural hazards such as bushfires, floods, sea level rise and urban heat. So again, not quite as we're not as exposed as some of our local government neighbours here and there. The response 10 is sequence planned growth in greenfield areas, also not particularly applicable, and manage land uses beyond the urban footprint, which is not really applicable to North Sydney. Next. And then the last one is to protect and enhance the natural environment. The New South Wales Government commits to updating tree canopy capture data and mapping for Sydney, develop an urban greening guide for Sydney, and Council is committed to developing locally appropriate canopy and greening targets. Next. So our recommendations are to provide programs and incentives to increase the number of trees in areas such as North Sydney, review existing landscaping, site coverage, deep soil and open space control in state planning policies and apartment design guide to achieve the 40% target, acknowledging that many of the areas of growth are responsible for the loss of private tree canopy at least, and also to provide targets and guidance to protect and enhance waterways, biodiversity, bushland and connected green spaces. Next. And just some general comments about the plan. Obviously, we support state and regional strategic planning. We welcome it. Many of the priorities and objectives are supported in broad terms. However, the plan does appear to be overly focused on the short term, as we've discussed, particularly around housing and its delivery, particularly work on affordable housing with an overly strong focus on delivery through the private development process and in a temporary sense, as we've discussed. It lacks the clarity, spatial direction and specificity. And I think that's the reason for that is that we're missing the district planning level of plan which can provide for that. It is short on spatial strategy that provides housing growth in an inclusive and supportive environment of livability. Unclear on what the role of the various agencies, including infrastructure providers, are in terms of supporting growth. That was one of the strengths of the previous plan. And the removal, as I say, of the district plan is a retrograde step without those specific characteristics that make places different and interesting in Sydney. Next. Last slide. So these plans were on public exhibition. They commenced on the 10th of December. Obviously, we're here tonight on the 19th. The council will consider a report at its meeting next Monday night on the 23rd. The 27th is when the public exhibition finishes. And it is expected that in Q2 of this year, these draft plans will come into operation sometime.
Councillors, is there any further questions?
So very good. Thank you. I was just wondering, there's 12. Are they in any order of priority? Oh, sorry.
I might have to take that on notice. I don't think so. I don't think so.
I just noticed the environment comes last.
I can get back to councillors on that. I'm not sure. I don't think so.
If you could actually provide a response, thank you.
Mayor Baker?
Just from a professional planner's perspective, why is it that they've chosen not to replicate or update the district plan? What is the philosophy around this level of just such high level blurred strategic planning and then no real guidance about how to update the LEP? Is that to provide flexibility to the state or flexibility to local planning?
Thanks for the question. Look, I think the first document that we described, the structure of strategic planning and the framework, the words in that document talk about simplifying the system. You can read that in different ways. Simplifying the system, I think it is about increased flexibility. You can also read that in different ways. But it is I think, holistically throughout the planning fraternity, there is concern that this level of planning, which was introduced, in 2018, was applauded quite roundly, and it's now gone, which is a real shame.
Councillors, are there any further questions? If not, that brings us to the end of the briefing. I would like to thank the Director of Planning and Environment and our team leader of Strategic Planning Policy for their extensive review and work on this item. Thank you.
Oh, I don't find that question now.